Hi everyone, I'm Gopika and Annie Florent is my film partner. We graduated from Columbia Documentary Program in 2020 and To the Plate is our thesis film. I'm happy to share very briefly our experience of finding the story and how it turned out to be something entirely different from how we initially saw and understood the story, and a couple of other lessons that we figured or learned along the way. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so when NYC went into a complete lockdown, Anik and I, we didn't really have a film in hand yet. It was only natural for us then to completely rely on social media platforms and Google to look out for stories. And we came across an Instagram post about gentrification in Chinatown, and that sort of led us to the restaurant Kopitiam. Kyo Pan, Kopitiam's owner, is our first point of contact. And we had multiple Zoom interviews with her. And at this point, we are still unsure what's our film going to be. So we are under the impression that it's going to be about Kopitiam, the restaurant, and how they overcame gentrification, or survived gentrification, and how they're dealing COVID and loss of business and all of that. But until Kyo mentions about her then restaurant partner, Moonlin Sai. So we then speak with Moonlin, and we had a couple of Zoom interviews with her as well. And that's when she happened to talk about How to Dinner as an initiative that she started with her romantic partner, Yin, and that they were making meals and delivering care packages to the elderly in Chinatown. And that's when that's the point when we realized, okay, this is going to be our film. And I mean, I think what you're trying to say is that sometimes your source or your character can take you on a completely different journey. So even when you think you've found your character, you've found your story, giving yourself space and a chance to look at the same story in another way, or just like asking yourself, is there another way to look at the story, actually really helps. And you might actually end up telling a bigger story than you thought you would in the beginning. And regarding filming of To the Plate, we shot the whole film during the lockdown. So we had to learn how to work with less footage. So we only shot for 3 days with our main characters. So we took to social media platforms again, and luckily our sources are active on Instagram, and they upload quite a few images and videos. So we kept tracking all the videos and stories and downloading them and asking them for archival footage, and also making sure that you include the right to use these materials in your release forms. So yeah, I mean, we remember that we first made the first trailer that we made. It was entirely out Instagram footage and images. And we also did ask our sources to film themselves, and which they did, but it's a very hard thing to do because most of them, most of the time they are really busy and they're trying to meet their own deadlines. And one thing to watch out for when you are asking your sources to film for you, and especially when you're heavily dependent on that footage, it's very natural for them to feel that they're doing a lot for us at this point. So 2 weeks before our deadline, our sources expressed concerns as to if they can continue to be part of the film. And we still had much to shoot at this point. So giving yourself and your sources the space to negotiate can really help at this point. So we told them, we had to tell them what exactly we needed at that point, and give a complete breakdown of our production schedule. And they said, okay, email us, and then we will get back to you. So we just had to negotiate and sort of find our way through and make sure that we take the project forward. So yeah, I think I would say that this whole experience of making a film from the beginning to the end during a pandemic, for Anik and I, it was more of troubleshooting. So we learned how to troubleshoot problems at almost every stage of our filmmaking. But I think most importantly, realizing that there's always a way around things, no matter what. So that's been our biggest takeaway, and also that being patient. This is filmmaking takes a really long time, so you have to be really patient with yourself and with your sources, and also being neutral helps. Like the more neutral you are, the more they open up. So yeah, that's from us.
Hi, my name is Olivia Diaz, and I am a recent graduate of the University of Richmond in Virginia. And my project is about food insecurity and access in Detroit, Michigan. So without further ado, so some background about food access in Michigan, and specifically in the southeastern region of Detroit. About 39% of the city's households are food insecure, according to data as recent as 2019, which given the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic since that time, further studies should indicate that that number has exponentially increased. Additionally, as of 2019, 40% of households were using SNAP benefits or welfare to get access to food, whether it be food stamps or other sources of welfare. Additionally, 35% of the population is at or below the poverty line in the city of Detroit. With all this said, there's about 68 grocery stores and 142 square mile radius in the city. So not only are there, studies that indicate families and people are struggling to afford food, it's also coupled with access to food, and that there aren't as many groceries in the city, to cover every neighborhood in every area. And these statistics are from the Detroit Food Policy Council and also the US Census. So that's all pre-pandemic for the most part, but there are some studies also from now and life since the pandemic. So most people would think that food insecurity was at its height when the pandemic first broke in March 2020, and there was a rise in the access, food and access. So about 75,000 families said that they had enough food, but not always the kind that they wanted, which is an important question to ask on behalf of the census and their pulse checks. And about 50,000 people were saying they sometimes did not have enough to eat. And then there was about 18,000 who said they did not have enough to eat. So those were some of the stats when the census first did its pulse checks back in 2020. But the problem has only actually gotten worse, whether people know it. When the census continued its pulse checks up into recent weeks, about 500,000, as opposed to the original 75,000, said that they had enough food, but not always the kind they wanted. Some 231,000 said that sometimes they don't have enough to eat. And about 66,000 said they often don't have enough to eat. So I originally proposed this topic of food access in Detroit at the time when the pandemic first broke. But through my research, I've seen that though there may not be as much attention to the issue, it's actually only gotten worse. And my project explores why this is and the impact, and what are some of the solutions to the problem of food access. So some people have had a more grassroots response to food and access. Antonio Hill, as seen on the left of the slide, literally takes food on a wagon and then makes meals and then passes them from house to house in his neighborhood, Rosedale neighborhood. His organization is called Prayers on Plates, and it's a one-man show. Hill oftentimes talks about how he himself is food insecure and knows what it's like to not to struggle with food, and then to also struggle with getting access to resources, whether it be because of lack of opportunity or also just the other social impacts that an access to food can have, such as embarrassment or shame. There's also April Agosta, as seen on the right, and she works in a suburb on the outskirts of the city. And her organization, Eagles Helping Hands, she started in her backyard, and thousands of people come to now what the high school football field to get food every week. And she pairs up with grocery chains like Costco and Sam's Club and Kroger to help take what's left over and then redistribute it so the food doesn't go to waste, especially in light of what she called a blight of food access. April's one-man show does indeed bring thousands. When I first came around 5 p.m. on a Wednesday, there's about 100 people that had come. And by the time I left, I would say 2 hours later, almost 900 people had stopped through. But April and Antonio's stories are frustrating because they see that their neighborhoods are struggling, and it makes you wonder, where else can people get food, especially if they have potentially support. I spoke with Alex Hill, who is a scholar at Wayne State University in Detroit, and he kind of explained why that, a statistic 60 grocery stores for the square radius of the city really hurts certain communities, and the asymmetric access to food and asymmetrically impacts certain neighborhoods. So as you can see, the red areas and the areas where they're considered food deserts. Hill doesn't believe in the term food desert, and he says it does more harm than good in areas like Detroit. Detroit was one of the first cities to be called a food desert, but Hill spoke of how he felt that a desert makes you feel like there isn't food there. When you think of desert, you think of no man's land, but it's not that there isn't food in Detroit. There's plenty of food, Hill said, but he said that it's who's getting the food and who has the opportunity to get it that really makes a difference. So, and there's some grassroots work in terms of just getting people access to food. But on the other side of the coin, there's also people who are thinking about the long-term solutions in light of there being a quote unquote food desert or food apartheid, about how to address food and access in a more sustainable way. What's unique about Detroit is, as many people might know, Detroit is a city built for a larger population than it currently has. So with all the more vacant areas, a lot of grassroots organizations have turned to urban farming. Detroit is actually kind of famous for its urban farming, I found through my reporting. An urban farm that I really enjoyed speaking with is Oakland Avenue Farmhouse. And what's unique about Oakland Ave is that they sell the food there and to contribute to the economy and to create jobs, but they also talk about the dual solution of creating farms, because not only does it create food, like growing food and healthy food and affordable food, but also creates community space in areas where if there's not a grocery store or there's not other types of stores, it's hard to get to know your neighbors. So the Jerry Ebron, who is the director of the farm, she grew up in the neighborhood, Oakland. So it also is people from the neighborhood coming together and creating solutions for the neighborhood. This is Dina George, and she's an AmeriCorps member who also works at the farm. There's also markets. Detroit has the third oldest farmers market in the United States, and it's wonderful. Many people who frequent Detroit know it at Eastern Market. I spoke with Eastern Market as well to see what they were doing, and they are expanding their markets to local markets across the city. So rather than having just one large big market that they've historically had, which they intend to maintain, they will also are looking at long-term solutions of spreading out resources and also creating pop-up markets across the city. I also got to speak with an organization called Make Food Not Waste, which kind of echoed what April was doing with Equal Helping Hands and taking leftover food that was going to waste and recognizing that Detroit is a food apartheid rather than a food desert, and making it into meals for people who might have an access. And it also, this organization allowed me to look at how restaurants and chefs in the area are also addressing the problem. Saffron de Trois, which is seen on the right, also is creating community events and donating food in addition to being a part of the business sector of the city. So that's a lot of information I just threw at you, but that's kind of overall some of the big picture things that I found in my reporting process. And now I'm on to the next steps, narrowing all that wealth of information, pitching my project, and striking the balance between background, which is important to really understanding the complexities of food and access in Detroit, and solutions and what people are doing about it in terms of long-term and short-term solutions. And if you have any suggestions, I would love to hear them. I can be reached at Olivia R. Diaz, or actually, that's incorrect. It's Olivia RC Diaz at gmail.com and at Olivia R. Diaz on Twitter. Thank you so much for taking the time to hear my presentation. I really appreciate it.
And now moving on to Brett and Brian.
I'll share the screen. So hi, I'm Brian, and my partner is Brett. We made this 30-minute documentary called Victoria's Foil as part of our project at Columbia University too. Gopika and Anik were our classmates. And we had the great support from the Pilsen Center, and Linda Winslow was our great advisor. So our project tells the story of Victoria Isaacson on her way to the qualifying journey to the Paralympics while discovering a rare debilitating disease, facing debt, and also the global pandemic all at the same time. So far, we've screened at several film festivals, and now it's on PBS and Roku, so you can catch it there.
So why did we choose this topic? Well, to be honest, when I started researching for documentary, I didn't even know wheelchair fencing was a sport. That was something I discovered just in my pre-reporting research. Just with the parameters of our Columbia program, I was trying to look for a storyline that could be contained to within a year. And I thought, oh, the Tokyo Paralympics are supposed to be happening at the end of this project. So let's see if there's an athlete around New York City. So I actually just started looking at different Team USA sports. And then I came across fencing. And then once I was in fencing is when I saw a tab for wheelchair fencing, which I thought was interesting. And then through that, I found Victoria Isaacson in Poughkeepsie, New York, which was about a 2-hour train ride from Manhattan. So not ideal, but also not out of the question. So once I started looking into Victoria and discovering she had Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, I realized I did not know what that was either. So it was a big learning process, figuring out how we are going to explain these two big parts of the film of Tori's life for audiences. So when I first met Victoria, on the screen there, you can see I actually wrote a pretty lengthy profile about meeting her and just what she's going through, kind of like a companion piece for the documentary. And it's published on the Pulitzer Center site. And so that's just an excerpt from it. But it was difficult to meet her. She's extremely busy all the time. If you've seen the film, you know that she is, and we try to convey that. And so I pretty much had to force myself into her life just to meet her. And then once I did, I left that first initial meeting I wrote about just knowing like this woman's incredible. I want to tell her story. She has to be what our documentary is about. But then as I mentioned, Brian, moving forward, the issues were going to be, how do we, in this short film, explain what parafencing are and what are Ehlers-Danlos syndrome? And so Brian and I actually have a couple of clips we want to show, just excerpts from the film.
Yeah, since these were major topics in our film and of course in Victoria's lives, we knew we had to spend a little bit of time explaining what those are, especially EDS. I've never heard of it before. And the type that Victoria has, because there's 12 to 13 different types, the hypermobile EDS is the least researched and the least understood type. And that's what Victoria had. And so here's a little clip from our film.
Library database. So I went into the library database and I did my own research. And then I made an appointment with a specialist in the field, and they did confirm that I had Ehlers-Danlos. So when you have a rare disease like Ehlers-Danlos, it's terrifying to watch your body slowly give up on you, and there's nothing you can do. So I have no structure of my foot or my ankle really anymore. So when I walk, my ankle collapses. So this is an orthotic base bottom. So it's nice to have one that fits again, because my leg atrophies so fast that the other one just didn't fit anymore after it atrophied so much. It's nice to walk again, even if it's only for like 10 minutes at a time.
So as our project was going on, we documented how she had to rely on her wheelchair a little bit more and more. And now I believe that she's, using it about half the time. Oh,
So I went into the
there we go.
And something I just want to add about EDS, we had originally interviewed the president and CEO of the Ehlers-Danlos Society from London. She's in New York City. And then ultimately in the final cut, we just chose to tell the story of the disease through Victoria rather than bringing in this expert, as it were. So then the other thing we had to tackle was explaining parafencing. And we decided we were going to explain both fencing and parafencing in one little sequence. And Brian, with his awesome graphic skills and knowledge, put together the sequence that you're about to see where we explained parafencing.
The Sao Paulo World Cup is our biggest competition outside of Paralympic Games. With it being the last chance qualifier, Tori, she has a chance to do it, but it's not going to be easy at all. Wheelchair fencing has been in the Olympics since 1960. The points are based off of the combined point total of your two best weapons.
Bravo! Move your body.
Epee, the target area is the torso, and it's a point weapon, so you stab your opponent on the torso area.
She's gonna go low. No. Don't commit.
Foil is also a point weapon. However, the target area here is the vest.
Saber is torso, including your arms and your head. And saber is the only weapon where it's a slashing weapon. It's literally like a lightsaber. Tori, she used to do all three weapons. Now she's dropped saber and is focused on epee and foil, which is her best road to the Paralympic Games. The Sao Paulo.
Okay.
My bad.
No worries. All right. So moving on with any documentary, there's obviously a lot of challenges involved. Gopika and Anik touched on many of them, but we're just going to kind of reiterate and kind of go through the challenges we face, especially.
Of course, our biggest one was COVID, especially given that Victoria was in an immunocompromised state. So we didn't want to endanger her, and she was hesitant to allow us to come film with her. And also her training sort of, dissipated over time because she had to do it all over Zoom. So she filmed herself during this time, and she shared that footage with us, which was very gracious of her. But also, figuring out how to change the story with COVID was a challenge as well.
Yeah, it switched from what we thought was going to be kind of a sports film where we go to Brazil and Japan with Tori, and then it became more of a introspective portrait of this young woman going through so many battles in her life. And another big challenge we had was just access to the subject. As I mentioned, she was a hard cookie to crack just to even meet her initially. There were several points where Brian and I kind of thought this project was just falling off the rails. She would go into bouts of depression. and we thought, oh my gosh, she doesn't want to film with us anymore. And I mean, can you blame someone to not want a camera in their face in their personal moments of their life for so many days at a time? So you know, it was hard to kind of get through to her, but you know, by the end, if you have seen the film, she has a lot of video diaries, and that's where we realized she was most open and vulnerable. And we got her to, a week before we were done with the film, do one last set of video diaries for us. And she really opened up. And I think it was key to kind of showing more of her in the film, and also just, you know, the fact that we weren't there with her in person made her more comfortable. So that kind of leads into our advice. Brian, if you want to go to the next slide. So just advice, you know, if you're tackling a similar subject or just any documentary or someone who's facing a illness like this, I mean, just be patient, research, talk to them, be empathetic. You know, you can ask the tough questions for sure, but it's best to ease into them. You know, don't push them to be too uncomfortable. There's moments in the film where you can tell Tori's a little agitated with us. There are other times where off camera she was definitely agitated with us, and you know, you don't have to film everything. Sometimes you can just talk to the person and you know, from there maybe work into getting it on camera. So that's kind of the tricky part with documentaries. And then
but luckily we had time on our side. That was the biggest thing. We filmed for such a long time. For Brett was just mentioning that he met Victoria for the first time about 2 years ago, and we finished this film about 10 months after that.
All right, and then just final thoughts. It probably would have been ideal to show the film to Victoria before we had our first public screening, but Brad and I were too busy. We just didn't even think about it. So she watched the film with everyone else when it premiered it with the Columbia Documentary Fest. And afterwards, she watched it with her parents, and she texted us. You know, it was very awkward to have her talk about all her mental health stuff while sitting next to her parents, because a lot of kids don't talk about that stuff with their parents. But then she said, we did a nice job. And it was that simple text that made Brian and I pretty happy with the result of the film, just to hear her approval in a way about how it turned out. So that is the end. I believe we're out of time. And thank you for listening.
Thank you both. We are halfway through. We have 3 more presentation, and also time we're hoping for more conversations. So we'll move on to Ramiro.
Let me get this started. Can y'all see everything okay?
Yes.
Okay. So hi everyone, my name's Ramiro. I also go by Ram, and I'm going to be presenting on my project today, the Mariposa Monarca narrative, stories of veterans and immigration. So real quick, a quick table of context. I'm going to talk about my reporting project, sort of like why I chose this topic, why it's an important topic that we should care about. And then I'll talk a little bit about my reporting challenges and advice for future fellows. And I do want to mention, so I have like section slides throughout my presentation, and I wanted to include quotes at the bottom of each of these because I took them. So these quotes are directly from the folks that I interviewed, and I wanted to highlight some of the difficulty of having these conversations. So whenever I get to a section slide, I'll pause briefly so that y'all can read the quote. So I'll pause briefly here. Okay. So I want to give a little bit of context real quick before I go into the depth of my story, because I think it's important to be able to understand how this issue of like veterans being deported even became a reality, right? So a couple of things that I learned throughout my reporting that I didn't know before. Number one is that you actually don't have to be a US citizen to join the armed forces. You can join the armed forces if you're a legal permanent resident or if you have a green card. And I also want to highlight that the U.S. Armed Forces tend to focus recruitment efforts in low-income, predominantly Black and Brown schools, especially like public schools. And so a lot of these schools tend to have also a lot of folks or a lot of students who are documented, who are not necessarily citizens, who are maybe like legal permanent residents and those kind of things. And so many of the folks that end up joining the army are joined with the promise of citizenship and stable income, right? Because when you're not a US citizen, a lot of jobs and opportunities are closed off for you. So that's one of like the key like driving forces of why some of these people decide to join the military to begin with. And so I really wanted to highlight that. And to give a little bit of like legal context, so during the 1990s, there were a series of immigration laws that were passed. And I think out of all of those, the one that I want to highlight is the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. And this was signed by the Clinton administration. And when he signed it, it pretty much made it legal to deport permanent residents who are convicted of crimes. And I think there was a specific emphasis on drug-related crimes, right? So I really like I'm this will come into play when I talk about the actual story. And then in 2002, President Bush was aware sort of this issue that like a lot of non-US citizens were joining the army and then facing obstacles when they went abroad because they weren't citizens and all these different things. So he signed an executive order that expedited the naturalization of non-citizens who are serving in an active duty status. So now that I kind of got over that context, so my story focused on the story of Miguel Perez Jr. He is from Chicago. He was not a citizen at the time when he first joined the army. He was a legal permanent resident. He served several tours in Afghanistan, and when he came back, he struggled with PTSD, like many veterans do, and so he started using drugs to cope because he faced a lot of obstacles accessing healthcare and resources through the VA. And he was going through a lot of things when he came back. And he was eventually caught, arrested, and charged. And so he was sentenced to prison and he served approximately 7 years. And so he began his sentence in 2011. And so while I was interviewing, right, he told me that he actually, while he was in prison, no one told him that he had an immigration hold. So he found out because he applied for a job in prison and they told him he wasn't eligible because he had an immigration hold, right? So that's literally how he found out. And his case got a lot of attention. Like there was a lot of like protests and stuff in Chicago at the time, but eventually he was deported in 2018, and he was actually arrested. Like the day that he finished his sentence, his prison sentence, he was arrested at the prison entrance by ICE agents. And so then, so that was in 2018, and a couple years later, Governor Pritzker ran his campaign to get elected, and this is him in this picture here. And during his campaign, a lot of activists pressured him. So he promised that if he was elected, he would bring Miguel back, right? And so Governor Pritzker won, gave Miguel a pardon, and Miguel became a US citizen in 2019. And he was actually invited to the 2020 State of the Union address by Jesus Chuy Garcia. That's his representative in Congress. And so my story focuses a lot on like his experience attending that address, Miguel, because at that address, President Trump highlighted a veteran who had gone through, like faced obstacles, PTSD and all of that, and who had started using drugs, but then he recovered, right? And he like turned his life around. And so that veteran was Tony Raskins, and he got a standing ovation at that address. And so Miguel was sitting there and saying like, well, like everyone's giving, like he was like, okay, he deserves a standing ovation, but like I'm sitting here and you deported me when I went through the same thing and you're giving him a standing ovation, right? So my story focuses on like that aspect of it. And then I interviewed a couple other folks for this. So I interviewed Joel Taboada. He is the president of a LULAC council. LULAC is the League of United Latin American Citizens. They're a nonprofit that do a lot of like civil rights work. He was a president of one of the councils, and he actually flew down to Reynosa when Miguel was deported. And that's actually, I live right across the border from Reynosa. So this is really, it hit home. And when I interviewed Joel, he also pointed to like a government accountability report by the US that stated that like, so President Bush, when he signed that executive order, like that didn't actually, like the different offices, the different armed forces didn't actually like put it into place. So he pointed to that. I also interviewed Carlos Luna, that's him right here. He's also a veteran, and he talked a lot about like the cognitive dissonance, right, that exists in like especially like conservative movements where like there's like pro-military patriot sentiments, and then there's also like anti-immigrant sentiments. And so what does that mean for Miguel, right, who's at the intersection of both, where he's a veteran but he's also an immigrant, and he like he was deported after serving the country. And I also actually got to interview US Senator Tammy Duckworth, who is actually a Purple Heart veteran herself. And she talked a lot about like the different legislation that she's trying to get passed. And one of them is the Healthcare Opportunities for Patriots in Exile, or the HOPE Act, where basically making veterans who are deported eligible to come back to the US, at least to receive healthcare through the VA and get resources. And this picture here is, she actually went to Tijuana, where there's a lot of like activists doing work for deported veterans for Veterans Day in 2019. And this is a picture of, this is Miguel, Carlos Luna, and this is Senator Tammy Duckworth. So now I'm gonna just talk about like why I chose this topic, and I'll pause briefly just to let folks read the quote. So I think this topic really chose me. I didn't really, this was not the topic that I was going into this with. I just wanted to report on something related to immigration and veterans, because a lot of folks in my family and back home face issues with immigration. So it was a topic that I felt really strongly about. And actually, when I was assigned to my advisor, Maria Zamudio, she's done a lot of reporting on this topic. And so she was kind of like giving me ideas and stuff. And she was an immense resource in helping me find contacts and people to talk to. So that I think this topic pretty much like it just landed on my laps, and I was like, this is it. Like, this is what I have to report on. And so as far as like why we should care, so the Biden-Harris administration promised during their campaign that they would bring back deported veterans, right? That was a promise that they made. And so recently they released a statement saying that they have plans to bring them back, but there's nothing concrete yet. And so I hope that like, you know, this topic really pushes forward the narratives that need to be pushed forward and the stories that need to be out there, so that they can pretty much keep their promise, right? And like finally resolve this issue once and for all. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my reporting challenges, and I'll pause so y'all can read the quotes. So I think I think it's similarly to what other folks have already stated. I personally had no journalism experience, right? So I had no clue how to even get started with this. I wasn't sure who to reach out to. I had no clue, right? I think again, like my advisor, Maria, was phenomenal. I'm super grateful that I was assigned to her. And also like I was unable to travel internationally because of college restrictions. So I had to figure out how to do this over Zoom, right? Like I often had to adjust to like on the spot to switching to phone calls because the internet wasn't working. Some folks didn't always reply to email. And I was literally interviewing people from my kitchen on my laptop. And it was also like kind of difficult to create a space of like trust and vulnerability virtually. And so, so it was just a lot, right, to do all of this on Zoom, and also just like acknowledging that like a lot of these conversations are difficult for the people to have them with me. So yeah, and then real quick, I'm about to wrap up because I know we're running out of time. So just advice for future fellows. I want to say that I think the best advice that I could have gotten was just to not be afraid to aim high. When I interviewed Senator Tammy Duckworth, I was like, I didn't even know how to get to her. But I just went on her website, and she had like a little thing where you could like request her for a virtual event. And so it wasn't necessarily a virtual event, but I filled it out anyway, and she got back to me, right? And it was crazy that I even got to interview her on Zoom. And also, I'm actually, my story is not quite done yet, but it's going to be done like by the end of October. And I'm actually getting it published in Spanish with El Debate. They're a really prominent news media outlet in Mexico. And again, like I didn't even know who to email there. I literally was like Debate editor, and then I looked her up on LinkedIn and I got her email, and then I emailed her, right? So my advice is just to like, don't be afraid to be like aim high, be resourceful, and also like give yourself grace. Like alter timelines if you need them to, ask for help and advice. And again, like the last one is believe in your own abilities, because I oftentimes ask myself, like during the summer, I was like, what have I gotten myself into, right? Like I feel like I'm not, but at the end of the day, like everything fell into place. So that's kind of my project.
Thank you. I'm going to hold close those 3 tips on advice. Thank you so much. Apurva, you're up next.
Good evening, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. I just want to start by thanking the Pulitzer Center for giving me the opportunity to report on this very, very important project. So back in March 2020, the Prime Minister of India announced a countrywide lockdown and asked citizens to be where they were. In the same month, there was a gathering by this group called Tablighi Jamaat, which is an international Islamic movement with hundreds and thousands of followers worldwide. And they were in New Delhi at the headquarters of the organizations. So when the Prime Minister announced this lockdown, they practically had to be inside the headquarters. And amongst the guidelines that were issued were maintaining social distance. And once I take you through the project, I'll show you the headquarters, and there was no way that thousands of people could have maintained that distance inside the headquarters. So that is where my story started, because I was in Washington DC interning, and I saw Corona Jihad trending on Twitter. I saw that a group of Muslims were being blamed for the spread of coronavirus in India. And it wasn't entirely surprising in a way, because ever since the current political party has come to power in India, there has been a lot of persecution of Muslims. What was interesting about this specific organization was that for the last 100 years, there was literally barely any media mention of the organization. No one really knew who they were. And this was by choice, because they chose to remain within their circles. They did not want to comment on whatever was going on politically. And for me, when I pitched the project, it was really clear that I wanted to tell the story through one family, because I feel like that creates the most impact. So I'm here in Washington and figuring out how to do this, because that's where things started really picking up in the US, and everyone started taking the pandemic seriously. So I went through a bunch of news stories that were being reported in India, and I came across the lawyer that was representing the members of the organization. So imagine there were thousands and thousands of members who were basically blamed, and some of them were in prisons, some of them were quarantined in centers with really, really poor conditions. They were not shown that they were corona positive. I don't even know there were tests back then. There were never any official figures shared actually of how many of those people were corona positive. But that organization was blamed for being the reason why it happened in India, and it was called a super spreader event. So I reached out to the lawyer and I got in touch with the person representing, kind of like a spokesperson for the entire community. And for me, it was a lot of learning, because I had no idea about the organization or what the cultural nuances were within it. So I was quite hesitant and I wasn't sure how to approach them. So I spoke to a lot of scholars and people who've studied or have been part of the community to understand, what were the best practices, like if there were any do's and don'ts, if there were things that I could or could not say. So one thing that I was told was, like they try to keep the women and kids out of, they wouldn't prefer that they talk to the media. So I kind of, had that in the back of my mind also. So, and then, so the first story came in August. So most of the thousands of the attendees decided to go back, take a plea bargain, because they had been in India for months. Their family were spread out around the world. They were suffering. Many were corona positive. Many had lost their family members who were in their respective countries. So about 1,000 members took a plea bargain, which is they reached a settlement, said that yes, we were to blame, paid a small amount so that they could go home. But 44 members decided to stay back and fight the charges and protect the organization. In the 45 was this one American family, and I have been in touch. I basically stayed in touch with them for the duration of my project, followed them, spoke to them, constantly remained in touch with them. And my first story was sharing how 44 people have decided to stay back in India, not return home, and fight the charges. And luckily, where the place where I was working agreed to accept that story, and they published it. It was an audio piece. Another thing that I was clear about at the back of my mind was that I wanted these stories to go out. I wanted an organization that could, a news organization that could amplify, because it was happening in real time. These cases were being tried and they were being persecuted in real time. So I wanted a news organization that could amplify the voices of these people. So that's when the first story happened. And after that, there were a series of trials and there was a series of hearings. So I stayed in touch with the family, the lawyers, and, checked in with them again and again. And all this while I was still in Washington. When I finally returned home last year in September, there was still no movement because of the pandemic. The hearings were delayed. They were happening remotely. Everything was moving at snail's pace. So at that point, I thought that, okay, maybe I need to create an audio documentary about how a section of political and media is using a false narrative and spreading disinformation about a group. So I pitched it to various organizations. It didn't materialize. But then finally in March, a moment came when the final results or the decision of the court was supposed to be announced on the 44 members who decided to, fight the charges. And as it turned out, all 44 were acquitted. So my second story was pitching it to the same, although I wasn't working with them anymore, I pitched it to the same news organization and told them, okay, now it's come, like we've come a full circle and the family is finally going home. I think it was very, very satisfying to report that story. And it was again an audio piece. My source was kind enough to get the excitement of his children on record. So the story actually began with his, kids being super excited, Abba, you're coming home. And yeah, and then they finally went back and they are back in the US now. So this person was from New York. I think the best part about this story was when my source messaged me that, Apurva, I can't thank you enough. I have tears in my eyes, and not to sound narcissistic or anything, but just having that one person, acknowledge, like, it gave him closure, like whatever ordeal he went through, staying in a foreign country for a year where he had no one, but just going through it and fighting it to protect his religion and then finally being able to go home. I feel like he said that the story gave him that closure. And then he sent me a picture of his 3 little kids on top of his back playing, and it felt like, it basically had a good ending. So in terms of learnings, I would say that transparency and showing up were 2 things that helped me create trust, cultivate trust with a lot of the members in the organization who are very, very hesitant and skeptical of media because of whatever reasons I've mentioned. But just doing those 2 things, like being super transparent, why am I doing this? What is the purpose? Where will it go? Are you okay? And running it by them constantly, I think really helped them also to trust me. Yeah, so I think those were my main takeaways. And once again, just thank you to the Pulitzer Center for the opportunity. If you don't mind, can I show you the pictures real quick?
Yeah, and just thank you as well. And I think this has come up as a theme in terms of how do you cultivate trust. So it sounds like a number of you have been thinking, utilizing different avenues throughout your reporting.
So can you guys see?
Okay. Yeah, I think if you just put in present mode and maybe just scroll through them, and then we'll move on to Mira, because I know we're actually right at 10 minutes. We're supposed to end at 10:20 because we have a quick turnaround, but I'm hoping Mira can have her full time and then we can have a little bit more just to start some.
Okay, so this
Quick
was
thing.
basically the headquarters, and I went there after I came back to India, and this is the entire place, that's the area around it. And this is Ahmad Ali, who was the technician from New York. And this is the picture I was talking about, but I've heard the faces of the kids. So yeah, thank you. Sorry, Meera.
Thank you. Meera, on to you.
Thank you for sharing those beautiful photos, by the way. Okay. Can everybody see my screen? I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay. So I'm presenting on my project, Exonerate or Abolish Prison Abolition and the Innocence Movement. So I ultimately wrote 3 different stories for the Pulitzer Center. One sort of on the power of language and discussing the criminal legal system. Another feature story, the center one, on Trisha Rojo Bushnell, who's the president of the Innocence Network. And then a third piece on using COVID-19 to sort of motivate the case for prison abolition. So I'm going to be talking about the first 2 mostly today, but feel free to reach out if you're interested in the third story. So for those who don't know, prison abolition is the movement to sort of abolish prisons and mass incarceration in the United States, but it's not just sort of about bulldozing prisons as physical institutions. So one of the big calls for the prison abolition movement is also to abolish the conditions which produced the modern carceral state. So that is shifting away from a system of racial capitalism that's acknowledging the ways in which incarceration produces many of the same conditions as slavery, right? It's often referred to as the new Jim Crow. So it's not just about the physical abolition of prisons. And the Innocence Movement is a movement that's led by a series of innocence projects or innocence organizations. And these are organizations that essentially work to help exonerate those who are wrongfully convicted. And so there's a sort of umbrella organization in the United States called the Innocence Network. And that basically, there are 67 different innocence projects, both in the US, but also in some countries abroad, that form part of this Innocence Network. All right, so there are 3 sort of main points of tension I want to flesh out between prison abolition and the Innocence Movement that kind of motivated my reporting. And so the first is sort of who these movements think should or shouldn't be in prison. So prison abolitionists will tell you that nobody should be in prison because the prison system as a whole is deeply broken, is racist, and perpetuates class-based discrimination. Whereas innocence projects and their advocacy focus primarily on the innocent. They hold that if you didn't commit a crime, you shouldn't be in prison, and some will argue and inadvertently imply that those who are guilty should. A second sort of point of tension I observed was that abolitionists and innocence attorneys frame wrongful conviction really differently. So prison abolitionists will sort of view wrongful conviction as the expected result of a legal system that is racist and broken. So they're not surprised, in other words, by wrongful conviction. Whereas innocence organizations in many ways frame wrongful conviction as sort of an accidental miscarriage of justice. It's what happened when the legal system errs. So these two sort of approach wrongful conviction very differently. And finally, the third point of tension I want to highlight is how these two movements view reform. So prison abolitionists, will tell you that we kind of can't reform the legal system. It's broken beyond repair, in other words, whereas innocence organizations oftentimes hold that we can reform the criminal legal system and actually have branches within their organizations focused on reform. So given these 3 points of tension, I was kind of curious, to what extent are these movements actually compatible? I noticed that there wasn't a lot of reporting connecting these two movements, even though there was a significant amount of reporting on the movements individually. And I realized that there are actually some attorneys who work at innocence organizations, but personally identify as prison abolitionists. So they kind of straddle both of these two camps, and that they are working within the Innocence Network, but at the same time, personally identify as prison abolitionists. So that led me to interview Trisha Rojo Bushnell, and I actually wrote my feature story about her. So Trisha is the president of the Innocence Network, which is that umbrella organization I mentioned of the 67 innocence organizations. She's actually the first woman of color to lead the network. She nominated herself to serve as president. And she's also the executive director of the Midwest Innocence Project, which is a Kansas City, Missouri-based organization that works to free the wrongfully convicted. Here is Trisha actually with Lamont McIntyre in the center on the day of his exoneration. Lamont spent 23 years in prison for a murder that he did not commit. And I decided basically to focus on Bushnell for my story because she personally does identify as a prison abolitionist. She is sort of at the top of the innocence world. She's the president of this network, and at the same time strongly believes in prison abolition. So I kind of addressed this question of what does it mean to be a prison abolitionist leading a movement that is primarily focused on innocence, and how does Trisha sort of reconcile those tensions that I outlined between the two movements? And so the first thing that I noticed in interviewing Bushnell that was kind of a main finding of my story was that innocence work actually isn't always about innocence. She kind of made the argument that innocence is a politically useful framing. She said, innocence cases are the clearest examples that the system is unfair in a way that everybody wants to care about. So in a way, it brings people to the table to consider criminal justice reforms who might not otherwise consider those reforms if they weren't framed around the language of innocence. She actually also mentioned that her organization doesn't hire people that are focused only on innocence. She said, in our office, when people interview and say, all I ever wanted to do is represent innocent people, we don't take those people because that's not what we're here for. So even though she is leading an innocence network, again, her focus isn't on hiring people that only care about doing work to help innocent people. Instead, Bushnell said that the main focus of her work and the reason she came to this work was because of systemic racism. She said that in her office, they say that systemic racism is the leading cause of wrongful conviction. So ultimately, what I found in my reporting was that Bushnell was able to really reconcile her personal beliefs in prison abolition with her innocence work. She said, I consistently ask myself, what does the world look like without prison? If we dedicate ourselves to saying we shouldn't incarcerate people, what are the alternatives? And let's do that. I just don't think that incarceration is the end result. So I want to talk briefly now about a second story I wrote. And this story is about sort of the role of language in discussing criminal justice reform. And so for this story, I interviewed Warren Wagner, who is a student organizer at the University of Chicago, my undergraduate institution. And he organizes as a part of Care Not Cops, which is a movement on campus to abolish UCPD, the University of Chicago Police Department. And they gained particular traction in recent years after UCPD shot a student of color during a mental health episode on campus. And so the takeaway I really had from this story was that the language we use in discussing the criminal legal system really matters. And this is something that Warren repeatedly emphasized in our interviews. So he basically argued that we shouldn't even be using the term criminal justice system because calling it the criminal justice system perpetuates the kind of false notion that it actually delivers justice, right? Calling it the criminal injustice system, he said, was a much more apt descriptor, given that that's what the system is actually reproducing. There are other folks I interviewed, though, who made the argument that, sure, the criminal justice system doesn't deliver justice today, but we should label it aspirationally. The goal is to deliver justice, so we should keep that term. A second sort of really interesting debate I found in terms of the language we use is how do we refer to the people who are incarcerated in prisons and jails around the United States? Do we call them inmates or criminals? Both terms that are incredibly dehumanizing, relatively sterile, and brand somebody solely based on one act, or incarcerated people. A descriptor I would argue is a better one. Next, how do we actually refer to prisons and jails, right? The conventional media will usually use the term prisons and jails, but Alec Karakatsanis, a civil rights lawyer I interviewed, and several others actually preferred to use the term human cages, acknowledging again that mass incarceration today is sort of the modern iteration of slavery in the United States, perpetuates the legacy of convict leasing and a lot of other racialized forms of control, and so argued that human cage was a much more apt descriptor. And finally, how do we actually describe criminal justice reform? Do we use the term criminal justice reform, or do we talk about reimagining justice instead? A lot of the folks that I interviewed argued that criminal justice reform is actually kind of a problematic term because a lot of politicians and progressives have sort of branded what are really just minor tweaks to the system as significant reforms, when in fact they're only kind of continuing the carceral machinery that by and large discriminates against poor people of color. So I just want to share a couple of my key reporting takeaways. So the first is that I think it's really important to utilize both your personal and academic networks. I spent my college actually interning at the Exoneration Project, which is an innocence organization in Chicago. And that's how I learned about a lot of these tensions and came to the idea of this project. And while I wrote my feature story on Bushnell, I actually interviewed all the other folks on the screen, and I was able to learn about them from the attorneys that I worked with at the Exoneration Project. I actually wrote my political science BA thesis on this topic as well, and bounced a lot of ideas for this reporting with my professors as well. Secondly, I would just say, always let yourself be surprised. I actually kind of came in with the preconceived idea that Trisha was going to tell me that she really struggled to reconcile the prison abolition and innocence movements, and that it was really hard to be someone who publicly identified as an abolitionist working within an organization so focused on innocence. But she didn't really have trouble reconciling the two, because she made the argument, like I described, that innocence work isn't actually about innocence. Next, pay attention to language. As I mentioned, I think the language we use in discussing the carceral state is incredibly important. I come from a background in opinion journalism, so I think I always want to gravitate towards writing opinion pieces. And these were news pieces, so I couldn't, but I realized that if I was really deliberate about the language I chose to use, I could make an argument, right, by using the term, for instance, criminal legal system instead of criminal justice system. And finally, just acknowledge whose voices you're uplifting and whose you're not. I recognize throughout my reporting, I interviewed attorneys, people who are in relative positions of power within society. And many of these were white male attorneys. I could have done a very different project that focused on interviewing individuals who were actually wrongfully convicted. And I recognize that that's a limitation of my reporting, that I'm not necessarily uplifting those voices. So I think it's really important to be transparent and open about the limitations of your reporting. And I think someone could do another project that would be fantastic on how individuals who are wrongfully convicted actually understand these tensions. And the last thing I just want to share with you all is always read. These are the books to me that have been most foundational in my understanding of the carceral state in the United States, both in my thesis, my reporting, and my kind of current work at the DOJ. And so if anyone is looking for recommendations, these are all books that I would suggest. So that is all I have for you guys, but thank you so much. And I would love to take any questions.
Thank you, Mira. I think we need to start a book list for all of these projects. There's so much richness. And just want to say we are over time. So before I forget, Kim has requested I do take a group photo, and then I'll have a couple of thoughts. So maybe we can stay on. So if you are able to share your screen and turn on your camera, that would be great. No worries if you cannot. We'll just wait a few more minutes or seconds. We don't have minutes, unfortunately. So I'll take a picture here in 3, 2, 1. And one more. Ram, I don't know, you can't take your mask off probably. Okay, no problem, all good. Okay, once again. Well, thank you all. I know we could stay a lot longer on this conversation, and I know we are over time. So I just perhaps want, for those of you who do need to leave to go on to the next sessions, but for those, maybe take a couple more minutes. One, to see if any of our presenters have a real pressing question that they want to ask the other presenters about. Just want to open up the floor for that here in the next minute or so. Also with the caveat that I hope this is not the end of the conversation, because so many things were raised here that we have each other's emails as well. But if our presenters wanted to ask another presenter a question. And then from, no hands raised, so from the group, any pressing thoughts or questions or comments even that you want to share with the presenters? I know there were some some sharing in the chat as well, but feel free to open your mic if there's something you want to say or ask.
I really appreciated Victoria's foil. I had a roommate actually in college who had EDS, and it was very challenging sometimes to watch how it impacted her body. And so I was really surprised, actually. I didn't know what the film was about, but I had to like publish some stuff for you guys, and I was like, oh, I should just like watch it. And it was very moving to see a film about it because it's so rare and not many people know about it, and she even has a hard time explaining it. So I was very moved by that. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a hard thing to explain. And as you said, not many people even know it exists. So that was one big challenge, as we mentioned.
Any other thoughts or comments before we part ways this morning or this evening?
I'm just impressed by sort of the level of empathy you all showed in your reporting. I think that's what sort of unites all of our different topics. You know, resonating with people and understanding their stories is obviously the secret to good journalism. So I think you all did that fabulously.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to point out that as someone who's currently still developing and working on the project, I'm really listening and paying attention to the choices you have to make, right? Everyone here has mentioned that you had an initial plan, or following your initial plan, then you were faced with XYZ situations and the decisions that you guys are making. So I just think that all of the decisions must be very difficult. None of them seem, I'm sure it must be full of doubt, but just well done, phenomenal, very, very powerful.
I also want to add to that, thank you guys for your transparency and vulnerability on how you let the story shift and move. My story is still ongoing and it's shifting all the time. And that's a little uncomfortable because so many unknowns, but I'm just enjoying the journey and the process of getting to the finish line. So thank you for sharing that because I feel reassured.
Yeah, thank you all. And I hear in my head Ram's points of advice: aim high, give yourself grace, believe in your own abilities. And then also what so many of you shared in terms of how do you build trust and how do you connect with different individuals.